Let me tell you something about deep thinkers. They're the ones who pause before answering, the ones who stare at the ceiling when everyone else is already laughing, the ones who live half in the world and half inside their own mind. To most people, they look distant, quiet, slow, maybe even strange.
But inside them, there's a storm of thought, constantly spinning, analyzing, connecting, wondering. You see, deep thinkers aren't just thinking, they're feeling their thoughts. They don't process the world through speed, they process it through depth. Every word, every silence, every detail carries weight, and that weight can be both a gift and a burden.
But what really goes on inside the mind of someone who thinks deeply? Why do they seem to care so much about things others overlook? And why, despite being so self-aware, do they often feel misunderstood? That's what we're exploring today, the psychology of people who are deep thinkers. Now, before we dive in, there's something important you should know.
Being a deep thinker isn't about having a high IQ or reading complex books. It's about how you experience the world, slowly, intensely, and with layers that most people never reach. So let's open that door.
To the inner world of minds that never stop asking why. Have you ever noticed how some people can't just enjoy a sunset? They start wondering about how the light bends through the atmosphere, or what it means that this moment will never happen again. That's not overthinking, that's depth in motion. It's curiosity meeting consciousness. Psychologists often associate deep thinking with a trait called intellectual overexcitability. It means your brain is constantly seeking patterns, meaning, and answers, even when it doesn't need to. It's like being tuned to a frequency higher than most people's minds. Everything vibrates louder. Every question echoes longer.
But that's the thing. When you live in constant reflection, silence isn't empty anymore. It's full of thoughts. And those thoughts can take you to beautiful places, or heavy ones. Deep thinkers often replay conversations long after they end. They analyze tone, word choice, expressions.
Why did she say it that way? Did I sound rude? Was there something more behind that smile? Their brain doesn't rest at the surface. It dives until it finds truth, or what feels like it. But here's the paradox. The same ability that helps them see the invisible patterns of life can also make them question their own worth. Because the more deeply you think, the more deeply you doubt. And sometimes, awareness can feel like a curse disguised as wisdom.
Studies on metacognition, which means thinking about thinking, show that people who reflect deeply on their thoughts tend to experience more anxiety, but also greater empathy. Why? Because when your mind can imagine every outcome, it can also imagine every pain.
Deep thinkers feel more because they see more, and they see more because they can't stop thinking. They often struggle in social settings not because they don't care, but because they care too much. They sense tension before it's visible. They pick up emotions others haven't even realized they're expressing. And sometimes that sensitivity makes them retreat. It's easier to understand the world from a distance than to survive it up close. But let's flip this perspective for a moment. They pick up emotions others haven't even realized they're expressing. And sometimes that sensitivity makes them retreat. It's easier to understand the world from a distance than to survive it up close. But let's flip this perspective for a moment. What if deep thinking isn't just a trait, but a form of art? Imagine a painter mixing colors nobody else sees, creating shades that exist only in his mind. That's what a deep thinker does, but with ideas, emotions, and meaning. Take Einstein, for instance. He used to spend hours daydreaming, imagining himself riding on a beam of light. That's not productive thinking, that's deep thinking. Unhurried, imaginative, infinite. Or Virginia Woolf, who once said,
I am rooted, but I flow. That's what being a deep thinker feels like. You're grounded in reality, but your mind is fluid, always moving, always expanding.
Now, here's a strange truth. Deep thinkers often feel lonely, even when surrounded by people, not because they don't have company, but because their conversations crave depth. They don't want to talk about the weather, they want to talk about why people chase storms. They don't want small talk, they want soul talk. And in a world that moves too fast, that kind of depth can feel like a foreign language. But here's something beautiful. Deep thinkers make extraordinary listeners, because when they listen, they don't just hear your words, they hear your pauses, your hesitations, the sentences you didn't finish. They connect the dots even you didn't know existed.
Research by Dr. Elaine Aron on highly sensitive people shows that those with deeper cognitive processing are often more creative, more empathetic, and better at pattern recognition. They don't just react, they reflect. They don't just think, they feel their thinking. And that's the subtle magic of their psychology.
While most people live moment to moment, deep thinkers live meaning to meaning. They don't ask what happened. They ask, what does it mean that it happened? Now, let's talk about something every deep thinker knows: mental fatigue.
When your mind never stops, rest doesn't always mean silence. You might be lying in bed, but your brain is replaying 10 possible futures. You might be having coffee, but your mind is dissecting a sentence someone said 3 days ago. When your mind never stops, rest doesn't always mean silence. You might be lying in bed, but your brain is replaying 10 possible futures. You might be having coffee, but your mind is dissecting a sentence someone said 3 days ago.
This is called cognitive rumination. It's when the brain loops thoughts without resolution, not because it wants to, but because it needs closure. But closure is rare for deep thinkers, because every answer opens another question. And that's why so many of them turn to art, writing, or music. It's not just expression, it's therapy.
It's how they translate the noise inside their mind into something the world can understand. And here's a psychological fact that explains it. When you externalize your thoughts, you reduce amygdala activity, which is linked to emotional intensity. In simple terms, writing, creating, or even talking helps deep thinkers calm the storm, because when their thoughts take form, they finally stop echoing. But let's pause here. There's a misconception that deep thinkers are all serious or sad. That's not true. Some of them laugh harder, love deeper, and find beauty in the smallest things, precisely because they notice them. A crack in the wall, a child's laugh, the smell of old books. They see poetry in the ordinary, and maybe that's their quiet superpower.
Turning the mundane into the meaningful. You can't rush their thoughts because they don't think in lines. They think in spirals. Every idea leads to another. Every moment connects to something bigger. They don't just look at the tree, they imagine the soil, the seed, the sunlight, the time it took to grow. And somewhere in that chain of thought, they find meaning, even when nobody else does. So if you're someone who's been called too quiet, too serious, or too deep, remember, your depth isn't a flaw. It's a lens, a rare one. And yes, it makes life heavier at times, but it also makes it more profound. Because you're not just living life, you're understanding it. But here's where it gets even more interesting. What if I told you that deep thinkers actually experience time differently? It sounds strange, but neuroscience backs it up. When your brain processes information in high detail, it slows down your perception of time. That's why moments feel longer, memories feel sharper, and silence feels alive. You're not living slower, you're just living deeper. And that changes everything. Because maybe, just maybe, deep thinkers aren't lost in thought. Maybe they're the only ones truly found in it. But here's the paradox. The same depth that makes deep thinkers extraordinary also makes them restless. Because once you've seen how vast the mind can be, you can never go back to the surface. You crave meaning in a world that often rewards noise. You seek silence in a place obsessed with sound. And you long for connection, but only the kind that feels real. Deep thinkers struggle in shallow waters because their mind is built for the ocean. But the ocean is lonely, and that's something few people talk about. You see, the deeper you think, the fewer people you find who can meet you there. Not because they don't care, but because most people live faster than they reflect. They move through emotions like scrolling through feeds, fast, distracted, forgetful. Deep thinkers can't do that. They sit with feelings, they dissect them, they make meaning from them. And that's why they remember everything, not in images, but in essence. Psychologists call this high depth of processing, and it's directly linked to creativity and intuition. It's the reason some people can predict the tone of a conversation before it begins, or feel tension in a room before a word is spoken. Their mind maps emotional undercurrents, constantly, subconsciously. But this awareness has a cost, emotional exhaustion, because when your mind feels everything, even joy can feel heavy. Even peace needs time to settle. There's a theory in cognitive psychology called the complexity paradox. It says that the more complexity a person perceives in life, the harder it is for them to feel simple happiness. Deep thinkers often fall into that paradox. They can see the beauty, but they also see the tragedy woven into it. They can feel love, but they also feel its fragility. They can laugh and still wonder why laughter feels like a rebellion against time. But maybe that's what makes them so rare. They don't escape reality. They face it in full definition. They don't look away from truth, even when it hurts. And that courage to feel it all is what gives their life a depth that others only glimpse. If you've ever felt like your thoughts are too much, too heavy, too abstract, too endless, remember this. Your brain isn't broken. It's beautifully complex. And that complexity allows you to experience reality in layers others never touch. In neuroscience, there's a term called default mode network. It's the part of the brain active during daydreaming and introspection. In deep thinkers, this network tends to be hyperactive. That's why, even when they're silent, their mind is speaking in essays. It's why they can stare out a window and see stories. It's why solitude feels like home. Not because they hate people, but because silence speaks in a language they understand. But here's where it gets fascinating. Deep thinkers are often misread as distant or cold, when in truth they're simply processing more than they can express. They're not quiet because they have nothing to say. They're quiet because their thoughts don't fit into small talk. And that's okay. In a world obsessed with speed, being thoughtful is an act of rebellion. Taking time to think deeply, to really think, is one of the last forms of spiritual stillness we have left. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you sat with a feeling long enough to understand it, not fix it? When was the last time you let silence answer instead of words? That's what deep thinkers do. They let time stretch until truth reveals itself. And sometimes they pay the price. Because thinking deeply means feeling deeply. And feeling deeply means breaking more often than others do. But it also means healing in ways others can't. There's a quote by Carl Jung that says, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." That's the heart of deep thinking. Not escaping the world, but waking up inside it. Deep thinkers are the ones who see stories in pain, lessons in loss, and beauty in imperfection. They look at chaos and search for meaning. They look at silence and find a song. And somehow, they make peace with the paradox that life is both beautiful and brutal at the same time. But here's something nobody tells them. You don't have to solve every thought. You don't have to understand every emotion. You're not a machine built for answers. You're a human built for wonder. And wonder isn't about knowing. It's about not knowing and being okay with it. If you're a deep thinker, you probably spend more time analyzing your life than living it. You replay mistakes. You question your choices. You compare your pace with others. But remember, reflection is meant to guide you, not trap you. The point of deep thinking isn't to perfect life, it's to appreciate it. To see meaning even when things don't make sense. Because sometimes, wisdom isn't clarity, it's compassion. It's saying, I don't have all the answers, but I'm still willing to understand. Deep thinkers are bridges between logic and emotion, intellect and empathy, science and soul. They see that every question isn't a problem, it's a doorway, and every person isn't a mystery. They're a mirror. That's why conversations with them feel different. You don't just talk, you unfold. You don't just explain, you reveal. And maybe that's what the world needs more of. Not more talking, but more understanding. In one study from the University of California, researchers found that people who engage in deep self-reflection are more likely to demonstrate long-term emotional resilience. They bounce back not because they're tougher, but because they've already explored their pain. They've named it, faced it, transformed it. So if you ever find yourself lost in thought, don't rush to escape. You're not lost, you're exploring. You're not overthinking, you're understanding. But here's a secret only deep thinkers know. The deeper you go, the more you realize there's no final answer. And that's okay, because the point of deep thinking isn't to find all the meaning in life, it's to find the meaning that moves you. Maybe that's why deep thinkers write poetry, paint, create, love differently. Because they've seen how fragile life is, and they don't want to waste a single moment of feeling it. They don't want a perfect story, they want an honest one. So to the deep thinkers watching this, don't apologize for thinking too much, caring too much, or feeling too much. This world needs minds that question, hearts that wonder, and souls that see beyond the surface. You are not too much. You're just in tune. And maybe, just maybe, you're not overthinking life. You're just thinking about it the way it deserves to be thought about, with depth, honesty, and awe. Because at the end of the day, being a deep thinker isn't about knowing everything. It's about noticing what others don't. And if that makes you different, be proud. Because, in a world full of noise, you are proof that silence still thinks, and that's the rarest kind of beauty there is.